So good afternoon. While I get myself settled, I just have to give you one excuse. It's an ice box up here, but I've made peace with it. So I'm a little cold, but I will survive. We are from Connecticut. I'm going to take my glasses off. I cannot see you without my glasses, but I can't see my notes with them. So I know you all look wonderful. And I do want to say, and we are going to really get into a discussion, but I want to be sure, Mary, could we just do, while I get settled here for 30 seconds, a quick introduction? Could everyone introduce themselves? I think that would be good, because you'll see the range of important civic leaders and organizations that are represented here today. And as I speak, you'll hear why it's so important that they're part of this dialogue.
Am I on? Yes. Mariela Castagnet, President of the Norwalk Hispanic Chamber of Commerce.
Hi everyone, my name is Moina Noor and I'm a member of the Al Madani Islamic Center, and I also sit on the board of the Norwalk Public Library.
Hi everyone, my name is Patty Santos and I'm with Family and Children's Agency. We work with first-time moms in the Norwalk community through home visiting and parenting groups.
Good afternoon, I'm Fernando Santiago. I also work alongside Patty with Family and Children's Agency. I work with first-time dads, and I'm a family support worker.
I'm Darius Williams. I'm a community advocate and a University of Connecticut student, as well as Vice President of the State Youth and College Division of the NAACP.
Excellent, so thank you. And I think we're missing one person who was coming from Inspirica, who works a lot with people experiencing homelessness. Do understand there's been a health issue, so we really wish him well. And we will, so we're going to get going. Christine is going to help me. I have a few slides, but they're not essential, right? They're just sort of to give you, for sort of a little way to follow along. But Christine, I'm the low-tech person on the totem pole, and I can't talk and advance my slides at the same time. So she's going to help me with that. So first of all, thank you to both leagues of women voters. Mary, thank you for that lovely introduction. And thanks for the opportunity to gin up some excitement on my home turf. So what Mary did not say, but I am from Stamford. Yes, I spent 26 years. I spent 26 years in Washington, D.C., but I grew up in Stamford. I moved back home almost 12 years ago. So I'm a local girl, and I think, I always really appreciate the opportunity to be involved in the community. So you might be thinking that 2020 seems like it's a little bit of a ways away, but I'm here to tell you to think again, because in Census world, we're in the home stretch. It's the 11th hour. We're under the 2-minute clock, whatever metaphor you want to use. But metaphors aside, the 2020 census is unfolding. It's starting as we speak. Field preparations are underway. There are tens of thousands of people that have already submitted their applications for census jobs. What they're calling early local census offices are opening now. And they're going to oversee the final address list updating this fall. And peak census operations starting 1 year from last week. So I'm glad you're here, because the census is a big friggin' deal. It is the very first responsibility of the federal government in the Constitution. I could talk about the census all day, of course, but I'm going to try to cover the highlights in 10 to 12 minutes. And since I grew up here, I can talk a New York minute. And I promise you the topic is not as nearly snooze-worthy as it may sound, unless, of course, you don't care about money or power, which is what the census is all about, and in that case, you can take a nap. So we'll start with why the census matters and what the fundamental problem is historically. Next, I'll give you a short overview of the 2020 census plan and the key milestones for this coming year. And then I'll give you the sobering news, why the Census Bureau could be sailing into what I call the perfect storm in 2020. Then we're going to hear from our civic leaders who are sharing the stage with me today, and then hopefully there'll be plenty of time for audience questions and dialogue. So, Christine, there we go, that slide. Thank you. Let's start with some basics. Why do we take a census? We take a census every 10 years, drum roll please, because the Constitution says so. It is the basis for fair apportionment of representation, and by virtue of the 14th Amendment, fair redistricting, that is one person, one vote, from the halls of Congress to your state legislatures. I know we have some city council, board of reps people here. Those districts are out, those district lines are drawn based on the census and school boards and the like. And the census determines the number of electors each state gets. And we know from 2000 and 2016 that that matters as well. So all of that has to do with political power. And Christine, next slide, please. And then there's the money factor. Lots and lots of money. More than $880 billion a year, that's a hard number to wrap your brain around, in federal aid alone is allocated to states and localities based directly or indirectly on census data. And in 2016, Connecticut got about $11 billion of those dollars. And then, of course, state dollars flow to localities, especially for services like education. But the fair and prudent distribution of funds for highway construction, special education, the school lunch program, Medicaid, the Medicare supplement, transit improvement, substance abuse. There's roughly 300 federal programs, again, that allocate money based on the census. We also, of course, use census data to evaluate need. You all know this, deliver services effectively. The Comprehensive American Community Survey, which is the ongoing part of the census, ongoing survey, and that produces the annually updated socioeconomic data. Those information help us plan and spend well and spend money prudently. And emergency preparedness and disaster response plans all center around data from the census. And then finally, businesses rely on census data, of course, to tell them where to locate new businesses, new services, what goods to sell in different communities, and the like. So the bottom line is that lawmakers and civic leaders can't make smart decisions, and you can't hold them accountable without an accurate census. And that's why you should care that the Census Bureau gets it right. So then the question is, does the Census Bureau get it right? Next slide, please. How good is the census? So let me just go over this quickly, but it's really fundamental. The census has been generally getting better decade after decade, and the Census Bureau's professional staff does a really good job, I think, with the resources they have under the parameters that Congress and the executive branch set for them. But the census is not an equal opportunity enumeration. It doesn't count all population groups equally well. And so people of color are missed at disproportionately high rates. Low-income households in both urban and rural areas are missed at higher rates. And at the other end of the balance sheet, non-Hispanic whites and wealthier households are overcounted. You know, well over half of Connecticut's Black residents live in what we call hard-to-count census tracts based on response rates from previous censuses. That's the fourth highest among all the states. Immigrants, single-parent headed households, mobile young adults, with college student here, all are at risk of being missed because they have lower self-response rates. And notably, children under the age of 5 have the highest disproportionate undercount of any age group. And Black and Hispanic young children are missed at twice the rate of non-Hispanic white children. Now, the undercounts and overcounts cancel each other out largely at the national level. And so the 2010 census at the national level looked pretty accurate. But we don't use census numbers at the national level, right? To draw legislative districts, to allocate program funds, to target new initiative. It's data at the local level that matters the most to understand and address community needs. And the people who are more likely to be missed generally tend not to live in the same communities as the people who tend to be double counted. And so the mistakes at the local level, where it matters, don't cancel each other out, they compound each other. And they skew the inequalities that flow from that picture. So some communities get more than their fair share of resources and political representation, and some get far less than they should. And we have to live with those results and the consequences for the next 10 years. So that's what I want you to keep in mind when we finish up here and sort of think about what is the problem we need to address. So where are we now? Next slide, please, Christine. Moving much more quickly now. So critical census preparations are underway, as I mentioned. Peak census operations start in less than a year. Most households will receive their census materials in mid-March of 2020. Yes, April 1st is 2010 is Census Day, but that is a reference day. The census does not start on April 1. I have to tell reporters this every week. Now, the internet will be the preferred method of response, and it's the first time people can respond online, but you also can answer by telephone for the first time or using a paper form. Now, there's going to be significant automation for the first time throughout the process. For example, census takers are going to be using smartphones when they go door to door to visit unresponsive households. But all this automation also means that this census is going to have a much smaller footprint in the field, I call it. There will be half as many regional offices and half as many local offices as there were in 2010. Connecticut is now in the New York region, not the Boston region, and the Connecticut will only have 3 offices this time. Danbury, New Haven, and Hartford instead of the 6 that we had in 2010. Now, 2019 is also the year they're going to do the final updating of the all-important address list. That's the framework for the census, by the way. That's the census universe. Some local offices, as I mentioned, but none of the Connecticut ones are opening now and February and early March. The rest of the local offices will open in early fall, including those in Connecticut. The education phase of a $500 million communications campaign is starting this year. All of the national ad buys have to be done this spring. And finally, the Census Bureau is helping states and localities create what we call complete count committees. And these are really important local units that can help supplement the Census Bureau's own outreach and messaging the national level, because look, the census really, it's planned at the national level, it's a federal responsibility and the federal government pays for it, but it's really conducted community by community across the country. And it only works, and it only works well, if there are trusted messengers and trusted voices helping to convince people about the importance and the safety of participating. So that's all the good stuff. And unfortunately, I'm going to wrap up with some more sobering news. You can have the next slide, please. But I think it's really important that we talk about this. I'm increasingly worried that the Census Bureau, about the Census Bureau's ability to pull off a successful census. And I define that as a census that counts all communities equally well. I do see a confluence of unprecedented factors, many outside of the Census Bureau's control, that threatened to create a perfect storm in 2020 and thwart a good count. So first, there's been insufficient, delayed, untimely annual funding throughout the 10-year cycle. And now we've got a friggin' shutdown, right, that's ended and might start again. And yes, the Census Bureau was affected by that shutdown. The bureaus had to delay, cut back, and cancel a lot of important testing throughout this decade. And remember, the census is unique among government activities. It cannot wait if it doesn't have its funding, right, to do what it has to do. It can't wait till next year to catch up. The census must be done. The Constitution says so every 10 years, and there are no do-overs. Now, second, this is our first high-tech census. I alluded to that earlier. And no one disputes the importance of modernizing the census. I did joke in my blog a couple of years ago, it was a little strange that the Girl Scouts started selling cookies online before you could respond to a census online, right? But technology also brings cybersecurity risks, right? Real ones such as phishing scams, hacking. I hate to say this, but Russia, we hope you're not listening, and perceived risks, right? People are increasingly reluctant to provide personal information online. Surveys are showing this. And then there's the likelihood of these disruptive, seedy disinformation campaigns like we saw with the last 2 elections. And then there is still a significant digital divide. So it especially affects rural areas, and there are rural areas in this state, and low-income households and older Americans that either lack reliable broadband service or just maybe don't have internet use or familiarity. Third, not surprisingly, there is a palpable climate of fear now in many communities, and that could depress census participation. Look, the anti-immigrant rhetoric and stepped-up federal enforcement activities have driven millions of people already into the shadows. Even people who are in the country legally, but whose status might be uncertain, or they live in mixed status households and they're concerned about other members of their families and their extended families. Yes, the strictest confidentiality laws on the federal books means that your information cannot be shared with any other government agency, with a court of law, a private entity, or used against you for any purpose. But I think many people do not trust this administration's intentions, and they are skeptical now that their responses won't be used somehow to harm them or their families. Fourth, of course, is the effects of the untested, and I would venture to say unnecessary, as we've now seen from some recent litigation, citizenship question on the 2020 census that was added at the 11th hour. So you've probably heard that the Justice Department, a little over a year ago, asked the Census Bureau to add a question on citizenship, which has not been asked of every household, and this particular question wasn't even asked then, since 1950. So times were different back then, right? And then without any field testing or any consultation to speak of with stakeholders, the Commerce Secretary, Wilbur Ross, announced last March that he was going to add the question. Despite the fact that most knowledgeable observers, including the Census Bureau's own expert staff, fear that this late change will reduce participation and increase costs and not improve accuracy. So census preparations now in this final year are proceeding, one, under the cloud of 7 lawsuits seeking to overturn Secretary Ross's decision, and number 2, under a deep suspicion of the motives for adding the question, because it's come out, as you've probably read in the papers, that the Secretary of Commerce didn't quite tell the whole story about how this question came about. And it turned out that it was his idea, talking with administration, political staff, almost immediately after he took office in early 2017 to add this citizenship question. He didn't tell the Census Bureau. He worked in secret to try and find a federal agency to send the required letter to the Census Bureau saying, we'd like these data. And that's how he got DOJ involved. And so, of course, all of that is making people very skeptical. You probably saw that 10 days ago, the New York judge that heard the first set of cases issued a scathing, lengthy opinion ordering the Commerce Secretary to take the citizenship question off of the census. Of course, the Justice Department has now appealed that ruling, not only to the Second Circuit, but then they've just asked the Supreme Court on Friday to leapfrog and hear the whole case on an expedited basis. So Congress, by the way, could get involved, because it's Congress that has responsibility for determining how to take the census, and so stay tuned. And then finally, and I'm going to wrap up here, there's the tweeter-in-chief. And the heated presidential primary season that's going to be taking place smack in the middle of this census. So it really pains me to say this, but I do fear that the census is the administration's next front in its war on immigration. And I think that's going to play out over the next year. And again, with the presidential election looming and the census starting in the middle of primaries in 2020, you know, all of this could be front and center and really affect how good the census is. So again, I'm going to have a few closing words in a minute, but before, because I don't want to end on a pessimistic note, but I do want to turn to our esteemed civic leaders here today, because what I've told you, I like to think is important, but it's the work that they do and that they're going to do that matters, because they're the trusted voices and they represent the communities that historically have been the most difficult to count accurately. So I'm going to throw out a general question and all of them are going to answer it. I think you're going to be interested to hear what they have to say. But here's what I would ask you, given the context that I've just given and some of the challenges that I've laid out. I think it'd be really helpful for us to hear how you think the populations that you serve, how are we going to reach them and encourage them and convince them to participate in the census? And what specific barriers do you see to achieving that? So why don't we pass the microphone around?
So 90% of the population that we serve in our program are undocumented. So obviously this is a huge issue when it comes to this topic. So number one is the fear that our clients will have to fill out this questionnaire. They already have a fear to participate in our programs as it is, because they're afraid that their legal status is going to interfere, that they might get detained or they might get deported. I think that one of the reasons that a lot of our parents come to us is word of mouth, right? So we have a family who has been with the home visiting program for 3 years and they tell their friends, you know, it's safe, nothing has happened to us. But the problem that we face is the lack of resources, like healthcare is one of them. A lot of our clients just have a discount card and the only option they have is the Norwalk Community Health Center, but what if they need care beyond that? Substance abuse or special ed education. So that's where our jobs become a little bit hard because we don't have enough resources for the undocumented. So I guess we could help educate our families and encourage them to fill out the census, even though we perceive that the fear will be there. They will definitely get afraid. of filling out that information. So I guess it's actually a good time for all of us to talk about this topic now in 2019 and see how we could make a difference.
Good afternoon again. I think the first step to kind of tackling this issue is what we're doing now, which is meeting. I think, as Patty said, 90% of our clients are undocumented, and with certainty, I think we should again find a venue or something to kind of give them the information, explain to them what the census is, how it works, and to hear it from someone who's trained in the census. I think that works better than us giving them the information. However, I find it kind of hard walking away, being that I pride myself on the integrity of my work and my word, and if I can't give them certainty that them answering the question isn't going to get them in trouble, it kind of makes me want to hold back also. So I think that's a big problem. If we can't say, you're safe, this is okay to answer, then we can't really make any progress, if that makes any sense.
Well, he just said almost everything that I was going to say, but I agree that we need a grassroots effort in trying to reach the hard-to-count communities. I believe that not everything can just be, I understand that we are in a modern society, although we do need to still maintain a grassroots effort, as she was saying, going door to door, meeting with the people that, a lot of people don't understand what the census is really for. And it is about education and getting out in the community. And I think that that can only really happen for people who already feel threatened and marginalized, is if we actually see them face to face and they see that we're trying to help them and are in their corner as people.
Yeah, I can speak. So I would say at our mosque about 75% of our congregation are immigrants and recent immigrants, and many of them come from predominantly Muslim countries, and so I think there will be definitely a feeling of fear to fill out something. I don't know all the questions. Like, are there questions like where were you born, or so I'm not sure about all of that. So. And while I think we have all these concerns, we know that the census is so important, both for the money and the power. And I think what we did with, I'm kind of seeing it like what we did for voter registration. And at that time, there were a few of us who really felt like it was very important to get people who don't necessarily vote to vote. And so I think there's a big education process, both in the community from people they trust, and maybe from some outside members of the community to come in and talk about the importance of it, to reassure people that there's not going to be a negative consequence, and maybe also to try and get younger people involved in it too, because there are language barriers, there are oftentimes anything with a computer that needs to be done with the younger members of the family as opposed to some of the older members of the family. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be a lot of grassroots effort on our part to try and make sure that everyone counts for the reasons that you just mentioned.
Yeah, thank you again for having me. So we hear all the issues that we have, immigration and how we're going to reach all these people, and it's great to meet today. And hopefully we can meet often and come up with a plan, so how we're going to reach and educate ourselves to be able to educate our population, so that we can reach everybody and make sure that everybody's going to answer this census. I think being here today, this is a beginning, but it's just the beginning. So we need to definitely make a plan bring the education and the importance of the census to everyone in Norwalk, in Connecticut.
Great. Well, thanks, Mary. I'm just going to wrap up in 2 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for audience. So thank you all. You know, these comments and observations are so critical because you hear a theme of fear, right? Which is just so unfortunate, but it's reality. And then, but I think everyone recognizes this is why we have to pay attention now, right? Because it's going to take some time. It's going to take some planning. I know we had a lot of local elected officials, current and former, in the audience. You've got to take the lead and get the cities, get Stamford, get Norwalk. We've got to get our new governor moving on this. We need a complete count committee at the state level, and then at the local levels it will be populated by people who are influential and trusted in the communities, starting with the types of people who are on the stage now, faith leaders, educators, business leaders really have a role to play, and others. So, look, the challenges are great. The stakes are broad, they're deep. I hope, I gave you some sense of that. But giving up is not an option, and sitting this one out is not an option. We can do this, and I think you can help, if only by knowing what's at stake and why it's important to participate, right? Important for your country, for Connecticut, and for your community. It's really important. I think it's just very telling that an organization like the League of Women Voters, bless you all, makes this front and center, because the census is part of a civic engagement continuum. People forget, a lot of people think of voting, but it starts with the census. And then there's redistricting, the allocation of political representation, and then there's voting. And then we start again 10 years later. So this is a really important thing to get involved in. I am not on Twitter, and I am not going to be, but hashtag save the census, hashtag everyone counts, and let's hope we don't see hashtag fake numbers from hashtag @real Donald Trump. I'm not going after him, I'm going after his Twitter account. That's what's dangerous, because public confidence in the census process could plummet. Congress could question the results, and we could be looking at a challenge to the resulting apportionment for only the second time in our nation's history. So again, on that note, thank you again to the League of Women Voters, Stamford, Norwalk, to my colleagues, and I look forward, as I'm sure they do, to taking some questions. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Terry Ann. We're going to get a microphone down on the floor. And Terry Ann's going to come over here and kind of lead this discussion and moderate our Q&A from the audience. While they're getting that set up, everybody who got a program should also have gotten an evaluation, very short little evaluation. If you are not on our League of Women Voters, sorry, this is like blinding. If you're not on our League of Women Voters email list, I would encourage you to provide your email. I promise we don't send out tons of crazy emails, but we will be sending out information on the census. So if you are interested in knowing more, hopefully there will be a complete count committee locally. So if there's information about that we have, we'll be glad to pass that on to our email list, but we need to know your email. So please, many of you are already on it, but please fill out that evaluation as well. That's really valuable feedback to us, and then it will give us your information. So, do we have some questions? We have a microphone right here.
Terry Ann, I came here with another question, but I think what we clearly heard is you impressed us with the importance of this. You told these people you need their help, and they told you back, before we can help you, we have to know that the people we're trying to get are safe. And how can you give that assurance when every other week another company is announcing that all their credit card numbers are public?
That's a great question. I'll try to answer it briefly. You know, I think there's two things here. Is your data safe from a cybersecurity perspective? You know, the Census Bureau is working with the Department of Homeland Security, with the other cybersecurity agencies within the Commerce Department, of which the Census Bureau is a part, to secure the the IT systems that are going to be the framework for this census. So I think they're doing the darndest that they can. I think it'll be, and Congress needs to give the Census Bureau the money it needs to make sure that happens. By the way, for those of you who are advocating with our congressional delegation for adequate resources this year and next. But then they're also talking about the fear that your personal data, which the law strictly protects, somehow that will be breached. And it's very interesting that I heard today what national and state and regional advocates with whom I work daily said from the moment this idea of the citizenship question came up a year ago. They said, we who understand the importance of the census and want to encourage everyone to participate, are now not sure that we have the confidence that this Justice Department and this Department of Homeland Security won't somehow try to find a way to breach the strict confidentiality protections. And that's what you mirrored immediately. And so I think that the Census Bureau really has to come up with some very strong messaging. And I think the President, I think members of Congress, I think the Cabinet Secretaries have to come out very strongly and make it clear that under no circumstances will there be any effort to violate the law or to somehow use the census as an inroad to harming vulnerable populations. So it's going to take a lot.
Hi, I have a different question. I'm wondering if you can give us a little more detail about the kinds of questions that are on the census questionnaire. I know, like, in past decades, there was something called the long form that some people got, and most other people got the short form. And then there's the thing called the American Community Survey. I remember also in 2010 that there was a political movement telling people you shouldn't answer the census because they're, for example, going to come and take your guns away. Although there's no question on the census form that I know of, do you have any guns in your household? Does the census form ask, are you lesbian, gay, transgender? Does it ask anything like that? So can you give us a little more insight on what the questions are?
Sure, so let me do that rundown quickly. Fortunately, the census form is pretty short. It only asks, your name, and that gets stripped, but it needs your name to try and help unduplicate. We talked about overcounting, double counting. It needs an address because it doesn't just count people, it has to count you once and has to put you in the right place because of the way we distribute political representation. But it only asks your age, your gender, your race and ethnicity. Now, race and ethnicity are defined not by the Census Bureau, but by the Office of Management and Budget. They define the federal categories. There are a lot of options to put down what you think you are. You're not required to put down anything. But the only ethnicity is Hispanic or Latino, and not Hispanic or Latino at this point. There was, the Census Bureau had worked all decade to add a category for Middle Eastern and North African ancestry or ethnicity to that race question, but that was not to be after the election of November 2016. So race and ethnicity, and then household relationships. So how does everyone in the household relate to the person who answers the form? It's only one form per household, all right? And then there is a final question, what we call tenure, which is the only housing-related question. Do you own or do you rent? That's it. And that's a proxy, a loose proxy for low income and high income, by the way, when I talk about low income households. There used to be, attached to the census, through 2000, a longer form, so you know what you're talking about, the long form, that a sample of households received, about 1 in 6. That's where we get the very rich and vital socioeconomic information, educational attainment, labor force participation, language spoken at home, veteran status, your transportation, commuting patterns, and the like, and information about your housing unit, your home, that everyone involved in communities, use day in and day out to do your work. That has now morphed into the American Community Survey. So they detached it from the short form that we only get once every 10 years. But the ACS, I mentioned, the American Community Survey, is now an ongoing survey that only about 2.5% of households receive, housing units receive, month in, every year. So there's a sample month in and month out, and then the data are updated annually. So that gives policymakers and civic leaders really rich information, to make, on which to base timely decisions and to allocate funds, taxpayer dollars, prudently. The census does not ask about religion, the law prohibits that. Does not ask about guns, so we might see that from the dark web and the disinformation campaigns. That's what we have to fight against, that sort of misinformation. And it doesn't ask you how many cats and dogs you ask, but yes, every decade there are people who are always trying to push the Census Bureau to add questions on how many people have dogs and cats at home. They haven't added it yet. And please, I hope we hear some good questions that everyone on the stage can answer. I know I have to answer the technical questions, but.
Thank you so much for coming. It was very enjoyable and interesting. But one question, if we lose in the courts and the citizenship question does appear, if that question isn't answered, does that negate the whole response from a household?
So that's a good question. And I will say that those of us who are working to help prepare for what we call Get Out the Count campaigns, we're calling it GOTC. I take a little credit, I coined that term a few years ago. We are preparing for a census that has and doesn't have the citizenship question, because we don't know what's going to happen. But everyone, all organizations that I work for are saying, what can we tell people? So here's the bottom line. The Census Bureau can't say this because the law requires your response to the census, although nobody's gone to jail for not answering, and therefore it requires your response to every question. So the Census Bureau dances around that. And then I stand up and say, here's the bottom line. Yes, you can submit your form if you have not answered all questions. You will be able to do so online. I understand you'll get a few prompts. You forgot to answer this one before you go on to the next one. Whatever. But in the end, you will be able to hit submit online. You've always been able to send in a paper form with some missing questions. And the Census Bureau doesn't have the resources and the people to go back out, to go and knock on a door if you just skipped a question or two. They will use administrative data that they have from other agencies. They can get data from other agencies, they just can't give anything back to other agencies. And they use some statistical methods, modeling, to help fill in the blanks. So the bottom line is, I would say to people, if I was you, and people were saying, I'll answer the census, but I really don't want to answer that question, here's what I would say. I would not say to them, you don't have to answer, because that's telling them to violate the law. So don't use those words. I would say, well, while the law does require your response, do the best you can. It's really important to be counted. Nuance, that's my specialty. So I hope that helps.
Hello. Two more mechanical questions. Sorry for the boring part. You already answered what questions are on there. how is the determination made as to whether somebody comes to my door, or I do something online, or I get something in the mail? That's one question. The other one is, since the most important part of this whole thing is counting people, how does the Census Bureau know that what I'm telling is the truth? If I say 8 people live in my house, how do they know 8 people don't live in my house?
Yeah, so those are really good questions. And by the way, there's 2 things that are important, and I did mention it, but let me repeat it. They need to know how many people there are and where they live, because of the way our democracy works, right? We allocate political representation based on communities where you live. So it's not just the number of people, right? That's important. But very quickly, so what will happen is there's 2 phases. One is self-response. So most households, 80% of households in mid-March of 2020 will get a package by mail, U.S. mail, in mid-March of 2020. And it will be a letter of invitation with a unique code to go online and answer the census. And there will also be messages, just so you know, in 13 other languages if necessary. There will also be a phone number to call if you want to answer by phone or have questions. About 20% of households will get that letter to go online, but will also get a paper form in the first mailing. And that'll be based on where the Census Bureau thinks areas are that have lower internet usage or Wi-Fi reliability and the like. Rural areas, by the way, will not get their materials in the mail. Census workers will be dropping off your materials door to door and updating the address list as they go, because of the way addresses work. They're not as traditional. So there'll be about a 6-week self-response period, and you'll get a reminder postcard, and then you'll get another letter, and in the 4th mailing, which will be by mid-April, so you'll go past April 1, any household that hasn't self-responded by mail, internet, or phone will get a paper form. So everybody will have an option to fill it out by paper, even if you didn't get one to start with. And then we get to the second big phase in early May, and that's the non-response follow-up. And that's where the Census Bureau has its army of about 500,000 temporary but sworn to confidentiality for their life census takers who will go door to door to all of the households that didn't self-respond. So that's how it works. And then very quickly, in response to how do they know if you told the truth? Look, they don't know on a case-by-case basis, generally, if you did. They have a lot of, I hate to use a technical word, I'm not a technical person, but algorithms, and ways to say, look, if a whole neighborhood comes in with one person in each household, and this has happened a few times, it's called a one-pot problem, that tells them that maybe a census taker who was going out was doing what's called curb stoning and not bothering to knock on the door, but standing at the curb and saying one person, one person, one person. So they sort of have some models, right, to look for problems. But I think the real concern is not so much that, the big concern are households that forget people. And they forget this, this undercount of young children. You're saying, how do they miss young children? Well, a lot of people fill out the form from oldest to youngest. That's just people think that way. And there's only space for 6 people. And then you can list up to 12, and the Census Bureau will follow up by phone to get information for people 7 through 12 or how. But so people may be listing and then they just say, they forget that there's a baby that came home from the hospital 2 weeks ago. Or maybe it's a grandparent, that is the primary caregiver for a young child. They're thinking, well, it's not my child, right? So there's a whole bunch of reasons. And we have these people on the stage here and the work they do, their organizations that have to help with the education to overcome that. So the real concern is that people, households, the head of households leaves people out. People who may be staying with you, a lot of LGBTQ youth, right? We call them couch surfers. They may they're not homeless in the traditional sense, but they may be staying with someone, a non-family, right? Non-family friends, because they don't have anywhere else to live. If that's their usual place of residence, as of April 1, they need to be counted, and we need to educate people to say you have to count people. The only other thing now, because of the internet, of course, that they're going to be worried about are bots, right? And those that are going to fraudulent online, you know, boom, 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 and some fake, you know, Russian, somewhere in Russia is submitting. So that's where the cybersecurity comes in, and hopefully they'll have that down.
Thanks again for all this information. The confidentiality piece was new to me. I didn't realize that the census cannot be shared. Could you just repeat again that policy? And then secondly, how can the community groups incorporate that in their message? Because I think that's terribly important. And can we really believe it?
Yes, so that is one of the key messages, yes. So I'm going to turn over the mic. Let me just repeat what the law provides. It is the strictest law on the federal books. Not even the provisions of the Patriot Act supersede this. The Census Bureau cannot share personal information, your personal responses. They cannot release anything other than aggregate statistics, divorced from, you know, any names or anything that would even disclose who you are. So they, you know, even if there's only one or two households, you know, in a very sparsely populated community, they may not even release, you know, data for the very smallest areas for that reason. So they cannot share information with any other agency of government for any purpose, federal, state, or local. So, you know, people are worried that if there's too many people in their housing unit and it violates a local housing code, they may be afraid to report everyone. We have to assure them that it's not the case. So there's double layer of protection. They cannot share it with anyone, any government agency, or obviously a private entity. The data cannot be subpoenaed. It is not subject to a Freedom of Information Act request. A court of law, a judge, may not require the release of the data. Your data cannot be used against you in any administrative proceeding or a court of law, and it literally may not be used, and this is the word in the law, to the detriment of any individual. So there's a double layer of protection. You can't share it, and it can't be used to harm you. The Census Bureau has never violated those confidentiality protections under current law. And I say current law because some of you may be aware that during World War II, the Census Act was not quite as strict. And the Census Bureau did, because of the War Powers Act, which told them to do this. Of course, the War Powers Act is now expired. But for those of you who were around then, did require the Census Bureau to share personal household census data on where Japanese Americans lived to facilitate the incarceration of internment, some people call it, of Japanese Americans. So yes, that happened. And after that, Congress said, this is not happening again, and they closed all the loopholes in the Census Act. So that's the technical stuff. The messaging, though, is important. So let's pass the mic down the line and say, well, what's the best way to share that message? Who should deliver it? You know, and what should people be saying to try to convince people that this is what the law provides?
I think one way we can do is just by explaining to people kind of how we explain know your rights about pertaining to the census. Know that it cannot be shared with any other government entity, local or federal. And once you educate people, that's then that's really all you can do.
I think the step before educating people, as a worker or agencies, we need to educate ourselves so we can pass the information along correctly. And I think it's also a way to tackle this is reaching them where they're at. We have to find forums where the population that we're trying to reach is at. We need to reach out churches, even parks, stores. We have to get creative with this because we keep mentioning the undocumented population, but there's a young population that is just kind of clueless. And with modern society, I think we've lost a lot of face-to-face interactions. People like to do everything over the phone or through computer. But I think seeing someone, putting a face to the person that's talking to you really helps a lot. And unfortunately, I think the face that is giving you the information just looks something almost relatable. At least for the population that we're trying to target, that it's really important.
I think we're going to have to bring you in, Terry, and to speak to our clients. I think personally, I feel like I need the reassurance first myself. This is a topic that touches close to home because I was undocumented for many years. I became a resident and now I'm a citizen. But I know what it feels like answering those type of questions. So I feel like the process for me personally will be for me to get reassurance first before I could go out and educate our clients. And also just bringing it back to our agency, meeting with our supervisors, directors, see what the plan could be for us to deliver this message to our clients.
So I guess I'll just echo the concern that I think in this day and age, there are so few things that feel confidential. So, and even if they were at a certain period of time, when can that be overturned or, so that's just a concern. But overall, I think, like you said, we're gonna have to educate ourselves, have maybe people come speak, be reassured ourselves, and then really get the message out there. Because I think if you convince people of that, if you really convince people, then your data is going to be, then the data will be so much better.
Yes, like I said before, I think that we need to educate ourselves and so that we can educate others. Maybe have these type of forums with our communities, reach out to churches and schools everywhere and educate them and starting soon that this is going to happen and you're going to be safe and participating in how important this is.
Yeah, I just quickly want to add one thing too. We also assume that everybody is literate. And we found out with online kindergarten registration that everybody is not literate in their home language or in English. So it's really those face-to-face interactions and that variety of methods of a phone-in method is ideal for that. I'm really glad to hear that. And I presume that there will be folks on the other end of that line that speak whatever language is needed to be spoken. So
let me just add, I want to make sure we get, I want to make sure we get to the other question, but let me just say quickly. So the census online will be available in 13 languages. That will include English. The same for telephone, 13 languages, and yes, so people on the other end will speak those. There will be language assistance guides in 60 languages that will include Braille. Regrettably, the paper form will only be available in English and Spanish, but again, there will be the translation guides. The one thing I wanted to say, because my colleague here made a very important point, that when it comes to conveying the message, It's really important in most instances that the people who are talking to you is somebody who looks like you, who sounds like you, right? Who lives in your community. So what I didn't spend much time on, but just a reminder, that means that the census takers really should be people who come from the community. And the low unemployment rate right now is going to be one of the biggest challenges for the Census Bureau, finding enough qualified, temporary employees to be in the local offices, to do some of the partnership work. That's the outreach work. They're hiring for that now, by the way. There are good jobs available now for the partnership program. And then, of course, to be the enumerators who go door to door. So all of your organization should be thinking about also trying to get the word out. And local officials, by the way, this is jobs, jobs, jobs. You know, the job site is open, and they're recruiting, even if it may be a while before they do some of the hiring. So, we want you to get the word out about that as well. Okay, so I honestly apologize. I don't have the website at my fingertips. If you go to census.gov, and they weren't updating it because of the shutdown, so hopefully they're updating it now. There will be a link right on there for this 2020 census job. So start with just census.gov.
Quick comment before I ask a question. It's basically just a head count. So why don't you just say it's just a head count? Don't worry about these other issues.
Well, the reason when you say the other issues, are you referencing the other data? The other demographic data? Yes. Well, it does matter, and I'll tell you why. You're right, fundamentally, it is a count of the population. And again, we have to get not just the count right, but the distribution of the population right. But the reason the data on race and ethnicity and age, for example, are important is because of the Voting Rights Act and because of the history in this country of depriving communities of color in many areas of fair opportunities or access to equal representation. So the Voting Rights Act, in order to implement that, requires census data on race and Hispanic origin and age, voting age, right? The household relationship data and some of the other, there's not much other data, are used for some other specific statutory purposes. But I do want that to be clear.
That's very interesting. Thank you. My question, I've never bought anything or done any transactions over the internet. There's not a chance on earth I will be responding to this on the internet.
Dad, you have a companion here.
How will they know, if I'm not in that first 80% who get the mailing, how will they know that I'm not going to respond on the internet?
So this is, I always say to people, when I talk about updating the address list, which they've been doing for years, and they're going to do the final field canvassing, they're hiring for that this fall. And I always say, now I know this sounds snooze-worthy, updating the address list, but the master address list is the frame, is the universe for the census. If an address, and those of you who are from local government here, you know why this is important. If an address, if a housing unit, it could be someone living in a trailer behind the main house. There are people whose homes are in garages. That's their living quarters, right? If that address of some sort is not on the master address file, not only is the census likely to miss that household, the Census Bureau won't know it missed you. So that's why that's important in the first instance, which gets to your question. So if you don't answer in the first week, you'll get a postcard. If you don't answer in the second or third week, they're going to nag you again with another letter. And as I said, by the fourth mailing, about 4 weeks after the mailings go out, if they didn't get a response from your address, they'll know you haven't self-responded, and they'll send you that paper questionnaire.
So that the 80% are that consists of the known addresses.
No, yes, I'm talking about it, yes, 80% of known addresses won't get a paper questionnaire in the first mailing.
Is it 80% of known addresses, or is it 80%, or is the 80% the known addresses?
No, 80% of known addresses.
Right, so my question is still valid, that if I don't get that mailing, then, you know, I've been in the census every time since 1950. How will they know if this year they don't send me a...
Well, presumably if your address is a stable address, it's going to be on the master address list. That list is an ongoing list. They don't know about you. It's housing units, it's addresses in the first instance that form the universe for the census. And they count people where they're at their usual place of residence as of April 1st of the census year. Does that make more sense?
It does, but I perceive that this could not, this technology thing is not, I don't think this is a good idea. Because people don't trust, I'm not the only one who doesn't trust this.
Right, so, two things. If you don't have your unique ID number that they're going to send your address, your household, you can still go online and answer without it. I did not mention that. I want you to know that. You can also telephone without the ID. All right, that's important to know. That's a very important feature. Again, 4 weeks into it, if they haven't gotten a response from your address, don't tell us what your address is. If they haven't gotten a response from your address, they will know, and you will get a paper form in the mail. I am sure. Is there anyone in your household who uses the internet or the phone? I didn't mean that facetiously. I meant who would be comfortable phoning in a response.
No.
Okay, so wait for the paper form. That's okay. If you don't get one, you might get one. I don't know, but...
By the way, another comment. I hear, just in my circle of who I hang out with in Norwalk, I hear more Creole spoken in Norwalk than I hear Spanish. So I don't see anybody from the Haitian community here, but I hope you do reach out to the Haitian community.
So that was actually one of my concerns when she first stated that the paper forms would be sent out only in English and or Spanish, being that the population of Creole-speaking Americans are rising, and it's going to be a bit harder to count them. So, yeah. And I also had a question. Can people proactively just already count their households online before they get anything in the mail?
No.
Okay, so no.
No, they don't want that to happen.
Okay.
They want to try to they want you to try to respond with that unique code you're going to get in the mail. So the online portal ain't going to open until they know probably 24 to 48 hours after they put everything in the mail, or in the rural areas they start dropping off the materials. Then the online portal will open. It's a good question, but they're going to have that down pat. And by the way, there's a huge Haitian American community in Stamford, where you are, right? Yeah, and Norwalk as well. I did speak to them a couple of times back before the 2010 census, so very important for our community.
Okay, I was going to ask about sample questions, which you've already answered, but having heard that answer, are you going to do a lot of publicity, advertising to let people know that those are the questions that you're interested in the answers? So hopefully be reassuring.
Yeah, so I always say, and I know you didn't mean this, but I always remind people I don't work for the Census Bureau, and I never have. I love them to death. So, but the Census Bureau that will be part of the large advertising campaign and the education phase, and that's why the communications campaign needed to start this year. And it's been delayed because of the lack of funding, and people like me who do policy have been pushing Congress to get them more money so they can do this advanced education. It looks like if they break the logjam on this 2019 funding, right, for the government, we the advocates, I'm an advocate, will probably get more than about 600 million more than the administration requested. Pat, I will say. But not just me. I mean, it's all the advocates who I advise on funding. We've said to Congress, we need more money for exactly that sort of thing. Education, more in-language assistance, and the like. But anyway, please, Ann.
And then also, the more educated we become as community leaders, then we can go out into our communities, and as my colleagues here said, we can have community conversations and going out to the communities, to the parks, to the schools, to the churches, to count and to ensure that they feel secure.
Can I ask another quick question? So how do they define Latino families or people? Is somebody who has one South American parent and one not South American parent Latino or not?
I'm going to let you answer, but let me give you the technical answer. I've actually written a lot over the decades about the federal collection of data on race and ethnicity. You know, it's such an interesting issue in this country, of course, but just very quickly. What you need to know is that answering the race and what they call the Hispanic origin question, those are two separate questions that the Census Bureau had hoped to combine, by the way, for this census, and again, that's not going to happen. It is all self-identification. And so you identify with whatever background, whatever race, ethnicity you want, number one. They're not going to question that. And number two, just keep in mind that since 2000, people can select one or more races or can select more than one Hispanic subgroup. All right, but that's the technical answer. So again, it's self-identification, but I'd certainly love to hear what you think about how you think people might respond.
It's very confusing because I'm not from here and I am Hispanic, but I'm a citizen. And I have two daughters and they were born here. So to me, that question is very confusing because they are American, I am not, but yes, I am. And they might identify as Hispanics, but they were born here. So you just clear that saying that is how you identified. So it's not legally actually how you, right. It's not legally you are or not, is how you identify yourself.
I too have two daughters in that circumstance, so I was asking partly because of what I do professionally, partly just personal curiosity.
Well, my daughter is biracial, and she was born right before, she's grown and married and all that, but she was born right before the 1990 census, but by the time the 2000 census rolled around, that was the first time the federal government, OMB, was considering adding the option of selecting more than one race. And I remember the New York Times reporter who knew me well at the time, he said, "Oh, what's Joelle gonna do?" And I said, "Well, I'm gonna leave it up to her, but I would identify her as black." And so she was quoted in the New York Times. That was kind of interesting, but it is. I mean, there's, our demographics are changing, but again, there's no right or wrong answers to those questions.
Thank you for coming. Just one little thing for those of you who are asking about what the questions were on the League of Women Voters Stanford Facebook page. I just put up the annotated. The Census.com seems to work for people to actually sit in for hiring, but you can't actually get to the questions on their website. So I got it from NPR. But the question I have...
All right, but just remind, census.gov, be careful, because again, we're afraid of fake websites and things, so be careful. But that's great, thank you.
So, but my question actually has to do with college students. College students. We have been telling college students that they should be registering to vote actually at their college. There's been a lot of movement for that. That may or may not be the same state where their family lives. Will college students get census forms where they're actually registered to vote? Should they fill it out for that state rather than be part of their household? And then my follow-up question is for Darius, how can we reach college students to make sure that you guys actually do vote?
So the latter question is the most important. So again, let me just give you the technical answer really quickly. So it does not, the census, where you are counted for the census, just keep in mind you have to divorce that from where you do anything else, including register to vote. It just is not the same. You should be counted where what's called your usual place of residence as of Census Day, April 1st, 2020. So, college students should be counted at their college. Unless they live at home while they're going to college, then that's your home. There will be what's called a group quarters enumeration. So if you're living in a college dorm or fraternity, sorority, some other group facility, you're counted that way through the administration of the university or college will be helping do the group quarters count. But if you live off campus in a regular house, you know, that college housing, then you're counted. You're going to get a form at that address. So you got two different situations there.
And then Darius, how can we actually make sure that you guys actually know about this and that you fill it out?
So, like I was talking about grassroots efforts with voter registration, going to the schools and universities, educating them about the census, why it matters, and what are the repercussions if it's not accurate. And that's the only thing that we can do is go to the universities, inform them, and try to get everyone to have their friends do it as well. Make sure that they, like for myself, I will try to make sure that all of my friends make sure that they are counted as well. And for voting, make sure that they all register to vote. They can register online. I sent links. How I did it with my younger friends, I just through Snapchat, Facebook, Twitter, any type of social media that young people use. You can send them the check your registration. If they thought they registered but did not register, they can check their registration or they can register online. I know a lot of young people prefer to do that. So.
All right, thank you.
So we're getting real close to 4 o'clock, and in respect to everyone's time, we'll take these last 2 questions.
Thank you for coming today. My question is about the legal challenge to the citizenship question, that it was not so much is it a valid and appropriate question, but was it noticed properly? And so if it stands, it continues to be upheld, what is the impact of that question appearing on the census?
Well, okay, so you make the correct observation that the judge in the New York case, he did not find that adding the question was unconstitutional. Although he didn't say that it was, he said there wasn't enough in the record to make that judgment. But he did find that the Secretary of Commerce violated the law that says how to add the procedure, as you correctly said, for adding questions to the census form. That he just made an arbitrary and capricious, those are the words in the law, decision. And I testified just a few days ago in the 2 cases that are in the Maryland court. So there's, as I said, there's a number of trials and cases going on. If it stays on the form, though, so in other words, if the Supreme Court overturns these lower court rulings, and if Congress doesn't act, if Congress somehow passes a bill that somehow goes into law, that's it. It's off the form. Then the consequences, I would, have them answer that question. You know, what will it mean for participation in the census? That's what we're afraid of.
To put it simply, none. I mean, we're talking about people who have everything here, who are in fear of going back to their countries, or in fear for their children, for their mothers, for their fathers. So I mean, if the question was raised and it's there, they're not going to answer. You're not going to get an accurate picture. It's just not going to be answered, or the census is not going to be completed at all.
Does it have consequences for generations?
Good way to put it.
Just wanted everybody to know that it's $25 an hour if you want to work for the census here in this area. I was able to complete the application by multitasking during some of the talking. It doesn't take a lot of time, so please go ahead and do that if you want to work for it, you want to serve your community. Second is the print circulation for the Stanford Advocate is under 7,000 in a community of 130,000 people. I assume the Norwalk Hour has similar circulation. So if you think that the old ways of getting the information out work, they don't. So you're going to have to use whatever medium you can. And in Norwalk and Stanford, we have television stations, public access television stations. So work with your local government to make sure that the information about the census goes up on your local television stations. I've already posted the information that I learned here, thank you very much, to my Facebook account, my Twitter account, on Nextdoor. All of these things are places you should go to make people aware of what's coming. Just letting people know, I already got, they didn't realize that you could be able to do it online, so this is, timely information to get out there. But I have a question. And just pontificate. If the federal government cuts back on the funding, do the states have the opportunity to supplement it if they want to make sure that they are counted? Corollary question is, there's a lot of news, maybe it's fake news that's out there about how Connecticut might lose a House seat. Is that accurate? Are we really in danger or not?
Let me answer that quickly because I know we're out of time. Let me take the last one first. Fortunately, Connecticut is not in danger of losing a congressional district this time around. So that's that. I mean, obviously, if the whole count goes south, then anything could happen. Maybe Congress won't even be reapportioned, but as I mentioned, but we are not. I'm sorry, the first question though, can states, so here's what states can do. States can put in money. You know how much money California is now allocating to do its own outreach and promotion? They can't take the count. The state can't hire people to take the count, but they can do outreach, promotion. They can give grants to nonprofit groups like yours. They can partner with philanthropy. And let me just say this quickly. I also advise philanthropy. I have for 10 years on the census. Philanthropy invested $34 million for the 2010 census, and they're way over that for this census. They've started earlier. I've been meeting with the Connecticut Council on Philanthropy, or I can't remember the name of it already. The Fairfield County Community Foundation is on the ball. So I think the local government officials need to be partnering with philanthropy for grant making, again, to give these kinds of organizations grants so that they can do their own focused outreach and promotion and targeted messaging campaigns and the like. So California, they are allocating $140 million for this census. That's how worried they are, compared to $2 million in 2010, but the economy was bad. They allocated about $24 million in 2000. $140 million. So Connecticut ain't gonna do that. And local governments are doing this, but again, the business community, go to the big businesses here and get them to put up some money. It is in their interest to have a good census. Businesses use data day in and day out. So, there's a lot, there are sources of money besides tax dollars, and I do hope the state, to some degree, and to the extent that local governments can step up to the plate.
I just want to mention, and we probably should have said this before, that Harold Coben from Nancy on Norwalk is here filming this, so hopefully it will be on Nancy on Norwalk. So that is a good resource as well for anybody that you know that would be interested in this. They could see the video or the film online. I want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank Terry Ann and our panel here. We really appreciate your being here, and once again to our elected and appointed officials, we really appreciate your service as well. So thank you all for coming on behalf of the Leagues of Norwalk and Stamford. Thank you.